Mai hoki mai, kia The Fold. Imihine ko ana toko ingoa. Welcome to The Fold. It's been 5 years since Bauer exited New Zealand, devastating the magazine industry here. Metro magazine, an iconic Auckland staple, was a casualty of that closure, but has found its feet again under new ownership, putting out 4 issues a year. Just as Auckland has evolved, so too has Metro. Henry Oliver has been editor of Metro for over 6 years now. He joins me today to talk about magazine life 5 years after that fateful day, the growing hum about the revival of the print magazine, the impact of social media on review and gossip culture, and how Metro stays relevant as a tastemaker. Henry Oliver, welcome back to The Fold. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's nice to have you back in the pod studio, although it wasn't this one that you were in last time, was it? Back in 2021?
No, this is much nicer.
Oh. So good Google review. Actually, it's a Metro review of our podcast
exactly.
studio.
Yeah, it's looking good. It's looking good.
I wanted to talk to you today because it has been 5 years since the closure of Bauer.
Yes.
Which was a fairly significant event, not just for magazines in New Zealand, but for media. Obviously, it was in the midst of the panic around the COVID-19 pandemic, the inability for magazines to continue to be printed during that time. I was listening to a Kristen Bell interview actually over the weekend, and apparently Cher told her that if something wouldn't matter in 5 years, it didn't matter.
Wow, okay.
What do you still view as consequential about the Bauer closure?
What was consequential? Well, in some ways, looking back on it, something needed to happen, and it did, you know?
Yeah.
Like, it sped up certain things that were probably going to happen anyway. So, you know, there was some sort of like creative destruction element to it that it certainly didn't read as at the time. So, you know, where we stand today as a sort of segment of the media industry is, I think, probably pretty close to where we would have ended up.
Right.
It just happened a lot quicker and a lot sort of, you know, more cutthroat than it would have otherwise. And that's not to like, I don't know, whenever I talk about the stuff and think about it, you know, I've always got to like preface that it was a pretty terrible thing for a lot of people. You know, there was a Zoom call and 237 people lost their jobs, and not all those people got similar jobs back. There's lots of bad elements to that, obviously, and, you know, unfortunate things sort of came of that. But at the same time, I think now it's like, you know, would have Bauer been a sort of slow decline leading to a sale to a private equity group, like probably something like that, you know?
So in some ways, even though it was absolutely shocking and horrifying for all involved at the time, there was sort of a quick yank of the plug out of the wall rather than a lingering.
Yeah, and you know, there's ups and downs to both of those things, for sure. But, you know, I think we've seen in other areas of the media industry where like a slow ripping off of the Band-Aid of, you know, a lot of small rounds of redundancies or small restructuring. And a lot of those things have kind of, you know, they've had to be repeated quite frequently. And then, you know, when I look at that from this other side of being like, wow, you know, our whole industry was kind of turned on its head in 1 hour. You know, I don't think one is necessarily worse than the other. You know, I don't think being made redundant at scale was necessarily like worse than the alternative.
Yeah, the sort of slow bleeding out. There's a comment that an analyst made, and it's around all of this NZME board stuff going on at the moment, but was talking about the fact that you can't shrink to greatness.
No.
And it sort of feels to a certain extent, it's not a perfect analogy, but it feels to a certain extent like sometimes the kind of slow eking away and what that does to the quality of the work and what you're trying to do can be more detrimental than a dramatic rug being pulled out, because sometimes with the rug being pulled out, there's an opportunity for reinvention, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I look at our media, which is the well, it's not a continuation of Bauer, but it is sort of what came in its place, i.e., some of the magazines from that stable, but also like some of the executive team and some of the sort of infrastructure ended up there. And I don't know the ins and outs of that business, but it seems to be like they're doing well, they're making good magazines, they've found a way to do it on this smaller, more efficient scale. That's probably better set up for sustainability in the long term than if Bauer had existed and slowly cut titles, slowly cut machinery.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's easier to start with a raise it to the ground approach.
Yeah.
And ensure you're fit for the current era that we're in. As I said, you were last on The Fold in 2021, and I'm sure you regularly listen to that episode.
I do, yeah.
And it was just a year into Metro's kind of new independent era. There's been a change of ownership since then, with Still buying it from Simon Chesterman. The magazine remains beautifully designed, fulsome, full of great writing. What are you most proud of?
I mean, I'm most proud of, I think, the magazine itself.
That it exists.
That it exists.
And it's great.
Yeah, and I think basically Simon, he bought it sort of during COVID, and we kind of restarted it together and then built a pretty small team. Like, basically our idea was like, well, if we start as small as possible, we'll have the best chance of survival, and so we kind of just had it just sort of appeared as this opportunity. Like, we could do this. We could get the title pretty cheaply. And we thought there was a way to sort of update it for the environment that we were going into. What we hadn't really anticipated was the sort of the pressure or the feeling of being of being the sort of owners of this legacy title. That there was a group of us who owned it together, and that we would. That it hadn't really dawned on us that it would get to this point where like we had to sort of we were the one, like, its longevity was up to us. Its sustainability was up to us, and once I think it did take maybe like it was a sort of, I thought about it as like we had a year of like bringing it back, and then there was a year of like, okay, it's back now. How do we turn this into what it can be in the future? And then once we'd done that, it was like, oh shit, like we own Metro and we make it, and there just felt like a lot of pressure there. And so, once we no longer owned it, in some ways, then it just became like, we don't have that element to the whole thing anymore. Now we just have to make a good magazine again, not that, that was always like, make a good magazine was always the main thing, but it's a nice feeling knowing that like it's whether it lives or dies isn't just on us. Yeah.
There's a good chat in that episode of the podcast, which you're probably really regretting not having listened to pre this. I just assume everybody listens to podcasts.
I did try and remember it while I was driving here. I was like, what did I say?
I'll jog your memory.
Yeah.
So there's lots of great and interesting things discussed about the design focus, but there is also a chat around how Metro might change. Essentially, I guess, evolving alongside Auckland. And so it was things like cafes and restaurants that maybe would never have gotten a look into cafe and restaurant award lists in the past, looking differently at how you do the schools edition.
Yeah.
I guess I got that there was a sense that there was a desire to reflect Auckland as it was and for it to be a bit more egalitarian.
Yeah. Yeah.
How has that evolution continued?
Well, I mean, part of it was, I think, part of it came from a kind of, let's say, in to out process of going like, well, this is what kind of magazine do we want to make, and what's our sort of lens on reflecting Auckland back to Aucklanders. So that was sort of part of it. That was like a conscious decision of like, we're going to try and diversify, both in terms of like people, but also in terms of like geography and whether if you're talking restaurants like cuisine or cafes, it's obvious. It's often like geography has a big part to do with it because it's very local, that kind of thing. Then there was also, I think, the kind of outward in thing was actually while we were undertaking that kind of transformation a little bit, so was the way people consumed those things. And so it wasn't just us going like, you need to pay more attention to, northern Thai food or whatever.
Yep.
But it was, a kind of, I think, a continuing evolution of what people were interested in. And part of that was like, I think there was that there were sort of some changes of like consumer behavior coming out of COVID, and that had to do with like, I think the local or like feeling like, if you like something and it exists and you want it to keep it existing, you kind of have to support it and all that thing. And I think that there's so part of the change was an editorial decision. Part of it was like a consumer decision. And then I also think that like we have, we're a very small team. And my approach to the magazine is always like, who do we have? So who works for us? That means, the people in the office every day. It also means the freelance sort of pool that we draw from. And what's the best magazine that we can make together? So it's not, I don't think there's like this platonic ideal of like Metro and like the best Metro could be, and then let's as a group work towards that. It's more like, okay, we are these people and these are our interests. What are the best thing we can do together? So, at that time, like Jean Teng was the food editor. It's now Charlotte, who has come from the spin-off. And they have slightly different interests. And that has, that has changed the magazine, and it's changed the way we cover food. And it's not like one's better than the other, or it wasn't a decision to go like, we need less of this thing and more of this thing, just that their interests are slightly different. And for me, the best the magazine can be is to reflect that as well as we can, of like, these are the things that, we as humans are interested in, and we want to share that with our readership,
And it helps, I think, to prevent it from becoming kind of stale. Not that it ever was, but if you're dogmatic about an editorial kind of outlook or position.
Yeah, and I think so, it's not that there's not value in that. Like I think there is, like if if the New Yorker gets a new editor, what's their goal? Their goal is to like make the best New Yorker magazine they can. It's not to go like, oh, what's the best expression of the talents that we have on staff at the moment? It's like there is an institution. People like it for specific reasons. It's not that it's necessarily like rigid and flexible. There is some flexibility to it, but it's quite a different thing, And I think, that that's quite a different way of looking to the editorial kind of scope and ambition of it. And I think sometimes, in the past, like Metro has had times when it's been a bit like that, I think, and other times it's been much more like either editor-led or staff-led in terms of where it's going. And so, yeah, that's a long way to say. Yes, some of those changes have happened, but they've happened for different reasons at different times. And I think they'll continue to,
Yeah, I mean, it's a great accidental segue into, because there is that fluidity, but then there is also that consistency with Metro as well. So there are the set piece.
Yeah. Yes. Set
pieces every year, and consistency can often be quite key for a magazine. People sort of want to be able to turn not quite to the same page maybe, but they want to be able to see the column where the column is and the social photos where the social photos are.
Yes.
So there is a balance, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember where I got this from, but when I first got my first job as a deputy editor, which was a kind of accident coming from freelance writing, I got this job and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so, I just read as many interviews and listened to a lot of interviews with magazine editors. And so there was this thing, and I just can't remember where it came from, but it's probably like one of those things that comes from a million places. But that, every issue needs like something that's expected and something that's a surprise. So you go like, I love this publication and I want to keep going back for it because I love this about it. And you need to sort of service as much of that as you can. But then if you only give people what they know that they want, they get bored with it or whatever. So, it kind of requires that doubling of like, you might like this, but you didn't know you might like it. And, but also I think that it's okay if you don't like it,
Yeah, I mean, it's quite, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's quite a lovely antidote to this sort of algorithmically driven, lane-based kind of media consumption. Overseas, perhaps I've missed it here, but overseas there's certainly been kind of a steady hum around the revival of print magazines. I think I've kind of been reading about it for about a year. Every time I read it, I think, is this real or is this just like trend-based reporting? But it has kind of maintained itself over the last year. So I think just this weekend I was reading about how Gen Z are bringing back kind of niche fashion magazines.
Yeah, I read that piece too.
Yeah. ID, which used to be owned by Vice, which obviously filed for bankruptcy, is now owned by Carly Kloss, and that's back on shelves. And The Atlantic is shifting back from doing 10 print editions every year to 12. What do you make of this talk of a print magazine revival?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's definitely the case, I think, in those kind of niche industries. Like I think fashion is a great example of something that is actually quite hard to replicate online. So, the sort of tradition of the fashion magazine, which includes, editorial imagery, which can be sort of fanciful and, not strictly commercial, is combined with, how to wear jeans with boots or whatever, and these are the best ones of the season, and this is where you buy them, and these are the prices in pounds or whatever, in an online environment that has very much become like primarily like a social media thing, so TikTok and Instagram in particular, and hasn't been replicated as well, I think, on native websites. I think partly because what I think works about that fashion magazine thing is that combination of like the editorial with the commercial. So, and my view on it is that in a online setting on social media, it's the commercial bit just sort of takes over, and people become, I think, quite cynical about that, but because there's not that balance. So I can totally get why these fashion magazines are finding a home, and that both for people who are nostalgic from the time of like fashion magazines' dominance, but also younger people who are sort of discovering these things. So like, they've found out that they've been through some years of like getting interested in fashion content and fashion influencers, and then there's only so many like how to develop your personal style videos you can watch before it all just becomes like a little bit like, ugh. So if someone then comes and here's this like, 400-page magazine that comes out twice a year, and it's beautiful, and yes, it's full of ads, but the ads are like,
the ads are beautiful.
Like, I can imagine myself as, a 24-year-old and just being like, oh my God, this is like a great experience, Like, I mean, I can never not come from a background of having grown up with magazines and loving magazines as a kid and being, and this is like actually true. Like, I just read magazines as a kid. Like, I barely read books. Like, I loved magazines. And so I can never not have come from that experience, but I get it. When I read that thing about, the return of these niche fashion magazines, I go, yeah, okay, if I was like in my early 20s and didn't come from this, and you just think about it fresh, it can be this beautiful thing, Like, I remember like someone telling me like when I was at university, like about the same age, I've gone like, oh, if someone invented the book now, people would be like, oh shit, this is amazing,
Wow.
Like, there's so much information in this thing, and the batteries never run out, and
the writing's all straight.
And and it's portable, and you can own it, and
it's been edited.
all of that, and all that stuff. If you just if you were an alien dropped to Earth, you'd be like, oh, this is cool, but because it's old fashioned or whatever, it's not like it's hard to think about it in that way, and I kind of see that. I see that in those magazines. I mean, it helps that like, it's no coincidence that those aren't current affairs magazines. You can do them, have one issue or two issues a year. There are a lot of brands with huge marketing budgets that are willing to, take pages in magazines that have very small print runs, but they go to influential people, So that whole thing about like, that real old way of looking at marketing where it's not about scale, it's about who the audience is rather than the size of it, So I understand why that works and why it doesn't work in other industries. So it's not like, I think the thing that some of these things get wrong is like, magazines are coming back from this area, in this niche area, therefore like the format itself is coming back. And I think the way that just, and I mean, that's true of magazines, like that doesn't really apply, but it's kind of true of everything, like handmade shoes are coming back, but no, they're not. They're coming back for like this specific group of people or whatever, or like.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that as much as in my heart and soul I want to believe that there's an era in which I won't look at my phone ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once again, I'm back talking about wanting to run into the forest. But I think the thing is that I think about magazines. And what I love so much about them, as a kid in Hamilton, like I would read Metro, and my biggest aspiration was to be in the social pages. And then I think I finally made it, and it was honestly the most revolting photo, which is, of course, Metro's prerogative and what they do. But it was kind of, and just shout out to Duncan Grieve and his favourite topic, part of a monoculture, right? Like it was sort of, there were a few texts that help us understand the world. And so Auckland was understood through the lens of Metro, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now it's just so completely fragmented. And that's why when I saw all of this stuff around the print magazine revival, my initial husk kind of cynical Gen X self was like, oh God, is this a micro trend?
Yeah.
And I think it's great. I thought what you said was actually, quite inspiring about Gen Z rediscovering this kind of thing and finding so much joy in the idea that you could have this tangible, tactile, beautiful thing, you know?
Yeah. And look, I think in some ways, we as an industry, if we haven't already, really need to not just sort of wake up to the idea that it is a niche product, but really embrace that it's a niche product. And I kind of, I just don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, this whole idea of the monoculture is interesting and valid, but at the same time, when there was a monoculture, it meant that there was, an underground or a counterculture. And now that there's not so much of a monoculture, kind of means that there aren't in the same ways like an underground or these countercultures. Because, if everything's niche, nothing's niche, or if everything's cool, nothing's cool, or all of these things, or that I kind of think that it's up to us to kind of embrace the nicheness of it and hope that there are people who want to be in that niche, you know?
Yeah, so your aspirations, and it's quite, I think this is a massive sort of paradigm shift for media everywhere, but this idea that scale is not everything.
Exactly. I mean, and I've certainly been in different parts of my career, really concerned about scale. And, I remember, I think when I worked here at the Spinoff, if I put a lot of effort into something and, I don't know if people still do this, but, we used to watch the Google Analytics all the time. And it was really this kind of not as a company policy or whatever, but more just a self, it was quite toxic, and to be here's this thing I put no real effort into, but it was just a kind of dumb idea, and then lots and lots of people read it, versus I tried really hard to write this meaningful feature article, and you're just seeing dribs and drabs of people clicking on it in real time.
Yeah, no, that's still a very familiar feeling.
To then come into, this physical format, there is definitely I think it does require kind of a different lens on things. And part of that is I think a recognition that there is there's, you've got to actually, I think, believe it to make it worth doing, that there is value and power in the niche. But it's also for me, I think, a change in ego or something, that it's not, it's not all about reaching the most people you can. It's kind of reaching, I think, people who would like it,
No, totally. I remember I had been writing columns for a couple of years, and it was kind of peak Twitter for me as well. And so I had gotten really used to the sort of instant validation when people were great article, Anna. And then at some point, that all started to ring really hollow, and I could feel it sort of eating me from the inside out. And I was asked by Tess Nicol at North and South if I wanted to write some columns and stuff for them. And I just remember thinking, oh my God,
no one's going to read it.
No one is going to tweet me
Yeah.
with a picture of the magazine to say, great article, because, so it took this kind of quite big adjustment, but ultimately I was like, oh, I actually love this. I love the idea that some rando could be reading this in a dentist's waiting room in 18 months' time.
Yeah.
And I will never even know about it,
Yeah. I mean, when most of my work was online, I remember being initially really flattered by the scale, and then increasingly just going oh, a lot of these people who are that thing was really great. They just read the headline or started reading it and then got bored or whatever. Now that I make this magazine, really if someone tells you that they liked this thing, I know that they went out of their way to get it, and that there's a higher chance that they've read it. But also, when I'm I meet people all the time and tell them what I do or whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, I used to read Metro, and then there's no pretending that they don't anymore, and that's fine too. You know what I mean? It's fine for people to not have read, whatever I wrote or whatever. I'm totally happy with that, rather than yeah, that thing was great, but it's quite, I don't know, hollow or something.
Yeah. Oh, no, definitely, yes. I mean, that was a different kind of era, I think, as a writer and working in media, and I would never want to go back.
No, I'm also very aware that the digital media landscape's changed quite a lot since I was, primarily, in it.
Yeah, I think we had, the halcyon kind of days of all of that. Nowadays, I'm just oh no, I do not want to know what anybody thinks about what I'm writing. Thank you very much. Just following on from that a little bit, that sort of digital tension, because you talked about the fact that you had people getting in touch with you after Bauer exited, prospective buyers or people who might be interested, and that a lot of them came at you with this sort of quite digital vision for Metro. You sort of talk of turning it into a Substack. Yeah,
that was one of the propositions for sure.
Interesting. And obviously Simon came to you with a different view. Do you feel a bit vindicated about hanging on to print as the kind of primary product? Or is there still pressure to keep dialing things up digitally?
There's not. There's not that pressure because, I think it could only really come from me or from our owners who don't have that view of it. They don't see it as primarily a digital business. And I don't know. Vindicated, maybe would have been a great business as a Substack, and that currently, it could have however many subscribers at, $9 a month or whatever it is, the going rate for Substack. Maybe that would have worked great. But I wasn't the person to do it, and not because, I certainly I thought about it, and it really just came down to that's not what I want to do with my days.
Yeah.
And nothing nothing that it's a bad thing or that that it would have been a bad product or that it wasn't a suitable format for certain aspects of what the magazine is, because there are certain ways in which it would, I think, translate quite well, but mostly I just, it didn't sound like fun to me.
No, totally. And look, this isn't to say that Metro doesn't have a digital presence.
Yeah.
You have a website. There There's stuff on it. It's very, very useful if you're ever looking for
Yep.
anywhere to eat. You
Got
have
2 newsletters now.
2 newsletters.
Not on Substack, but on something else. But yeah.
Good. That's good. But yeah, I think understanding it primarily as a print piece of work is beautiful. I wanted to talk about. So I am a huge fan. I don't know how many times I've read it now of Tina Brown's Vanity Fair diaries.
I mean, I read that. I read that in the month before I started this job.
Oh, was it one of your research tracks?
Well, it wasn't in that. It wasn't in that time because that was slightly earlier. But yes, it was certainly like preparation. And then I remember I had like 2 long quotes from that book in my like notes app that I really enjoyed coming back to.
Yeah, I confess it as having completely like probably not very useful romantic attachment to the notion of being an editor of a magazine during that era.
I know, exactly.
Can you imagine?
Yeah. For listeners that aren't aware, there was obviously a lot more money, but also, there was a bit where the publisher of the magazine was just sort of aghast that she was renting, and so just lent her an interest-free loan to buy a house in Manhattan. So great times. But, what I didn't sort of think about at the time but have reflected since about that book is like how, because it's not really the subject of the book, but, I was, when she was at the New Yorker was kind of like early in my relationship with that magazine. And, she was kind of hated for what she did there. And it's been really interesting to see a lot of what she brought in kind of like slowly become what the magazine is. She was right, but she was maybe just a bit too fast or too early, or just wanted to bring in changes too quickly. But
well, she was a Brit, right, coming into an American market, and there's been a little bit of that happening again in the States, and quite a lot of resistance.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing about her and with Graydon Carter as well is, these outsiders that become the kind of pinnacle of insiderdom. Really, there's a really interesting tension there, and they both handle it quite differently. But like, there is that, it made great magazines.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, Vanity Fair, Condé Nast, huge market, completely different kind of world. But I was again reading some stuff over the weekend about Rebecca Jones, who's stepping down as the Vanity Fair editor, and there was this article which was like, does anybody even want this job these days? And it was kind of going through like basically your days of like revenue meetings and website traffic and blah, 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 all of the decadence.
Yeah.
And I guess the romance of being a magazine editor has kind of gone, and it's totally different world, totally different country, completely different market. But is there still some fun?
I mean, I think so. I mean, it's funny because, there are definitely like aspects to the job which are like, revenue and spreadsheets and, especially since now that we have ownership, it's being accountable and responsible, I think, and just being like not too cautious, but going like, okay, what are the things that we're going to do and what are we going to spend money on? And I think knowing that you're going to have to be accountable for those things can be, it's not always a negative, but at the same time, sometimes I'm like, oh, I get to like put words next to pictures and I love it, and really I think both that there's a lot of freedom to make things that the way I or we want to do it, but also like just being really like surprised and impressed at the work that my colleagues do, and being like, seeing something come together that isn't something that I sort of directly did, and being like, oh shit, that's amazing. Like, this is great. It's like such a good, it's such a good feeling. And I think that is part of that romance, is like, there is a way in which like words and images kind of collide that's quite specific to magazines. And yeah, there's a real joy to that, to making that. And I also think that, like, for me, it's really important that the magazine looks and feels like there's been joy in its production, and that there's like risks taken, and there are they don't always pay off necessarily, but that it's always moving, and that it's been like fun to make, that hopefully that's sort of inherent in the thing itself, that there's an energy to it.
Yeah. I mean, you don't strike me as a person who's particularly enamoured of status, but do you think the editor of Metro magazine, that gig comes with status in this city still?
Well, yeah, I mean, I could be bashful and say no, but then I also know that I get invited to things that I wouldn't get invited to otherwise. And so, like, I know, I just know that to be true. And
it would be churlish to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, and and that I wind up in rooms or at dinners or whatever that I wouldn't be at, if it weren't for this job. And I'm also aware that, like, that is, it's not, I don't know, it's not a bad thing, but I also know that that's like part of, that's mostly like the job. It's not me. You know what I mean?
Oh, Henry.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes and no. But, there's also like, the flip side of that is lots and lots of Aucklanders, particularly those over a certain age, have a relationship with it.
Yeah.
And, so it's, it can be a nice cold splash of water to be like, oh, I used to love Metro. Is it still around? Or whatever, So
just make sure you don't get, too hyped up.
Yeah, and it's not like every room I walk into, people are like, wow, there's the editor of a Metro. It's certainly not the case. But my life would be different if I had a different job, for sure.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, I guess, the kind of climate we're living in when it comes to reviews.
Yes. Oh my God, I love this topic. Yeah.
Because so to give you an example, I have found, I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I frequently preach it to have been a failed experiment, and then am very hypocritical myself and constantly deleting Instagram. But when I'm in the gram, I get a lot of food content, obviously. I get a lot of local food stuff. I'm going to be honest and say I've been burnt a number of times kind of following recommendations, right?
Yeah.
Last night went to and I've learned, so last night went to a lovely pizza place as recommended by Metro.
Fantastic.
And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, and it's not just obviously within the world of food, it applies across, kind of a lot of your beats, really. You can be a wine, like I could be a wine expert tomorrow. I mean, don't tell my brothers, obviously. They're like, no, you could not. But, you can sort of spin yourself up if you're so inclined to become something of an expert or influencer online, right? It applies with arts and culture and all of that kind of stuff. What is the role of a magazine like Metro who will do an edition about the best wines and does the restaurant awards and like, what is the role of a magazine like Metro up against the tide of, I guess, kind of just, in Google reviews, influencers.
I think our role is to have both a point of view as well as a process and a kind of and a certain ethic. And I think we want to be in a position where whenever we're recommending something, that it's something that we actually recommend. When it comes to and we do this all the time because we bring in other people, right? So on the Restaurant of the Year Awards, we have a panel. Some of those have done it before, some of them for a while, some of them always new. And so there's always this thing of at the very start of the process to be like, this is how we do it. And this is what we're looking for. And one of those things is like, you need to, if we're recommending a restaurant, it has to be to a level where we would say like, friends visiting from out of town or something like that, and being like, you should go to this place. And knowing that, if you've got a friend and they've got, a certain level of expectation and a certain level of like food experience, if you see them to a bad restaurant, they're going to know it's bad. And they're going to go, oh, I spent that money at whatever restaurant and it wasn't that good. Thanks, guys, And so it's not that like we're saying, you don't know, like restaurants can be bad on any given night. But the same thing, like that's what we're doing is like when we're doing those awards, we're visiting the restaurants, we're paying for them ourselves. We're trying not to, we're not dressing in costume or anything, but we're not announcing our forthcoming visit or whatever. And, sometimes a restaurant might be a great restaurant, they have an off night and we have a bad experience and then it gets a bad review or it doesn't make the 50 or whatever, that's sad. But at the same time, that speaks to some sort of level of consistency. So if we're recommending a place, like that we know, okay, we're going to stand by it. So, we still publish negative reviews of restaurants. I think having said that, there's probably a type of restaurant that we just wouldn't publish a negative review. We think it's not like valid or worthwhile, But then on the other hand, dining out is increasingly expensive, and we want to be a consumer advocate in that way. We see ourselves as a consumer advocate and not an industry advocate. So we're not in the position of being a promoter of the hospitality sector. We are as a sort of side function, but primarily it's reader-based. All of that is quite a bit more complicated when it comes to the arts and culture.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is not our willingness to publish such things. It kind of comes from like a production point of view. So like, who are the writers that are going to want to write a negative review of a local novel, for example? They're very few and far between, and sometimes those that are willing to do that aren't necessarily operating on good faith. And I think, so it's about finding that combination. I don't know. I was trying to think. There was like, Kate Pryor wrote a review of King Lear for us that was like very critical, and it was very critical on like this technical level. And I thought, oh, well, this is, that was an example of like, here it is, it can be done. And it's not score settling and personal grudge. It's like, here were things that this play did that I thought were not successful.
It was a fantastic review.
Yeah.
And I think, in some ways, it's that beauty of being in print and almost, because you guys are out 4 times a year, so it's not like you can just go, well, we're going to review everything that happened in the last 3 months, including stuff that nobody cares about anymore. So you have to be selective. And I think that was a great example of being selective because of the quality of the critique, the writing, but also, it was a review of a very significant piece of work from our largest professional theatre company, right? And so there's sort of a wider set of things to think about when you read that kind of review. I think New Zealand is a very small country, and New Zealand's arts and culture sector even smaller. But also there's just this shitty thing that happens now when you write something like that, even in a print publication, just ricochets all over the internet. It's very hard for people just to sit with, like everybody reads critical or can read critique as like part of some kind of like a drama, or there's like beef going on. And sometimes there is beef going on. And that's to your point about, what people's agendas might be. But it also just kind of bounces around in a way that's like, can you not just read it and sit with it,
Yeah. I mean, I think on different levels, like on one level, more criticism, like you kind of need to have a house for negative criticism. You kind of just need more criticism in general.
Totally.
The other side of it is from like my sort of editorial point of view, having critique and often, well, not often, but like sometimes negative criticism kind of comes back to that, like having parts of the magazine that are consistent and having part of it that's a surprise. And I think one of the sort of downsides of, if you've got nothing nice to say, don't say it at all, is that you end up on just like an editorial level a less interesting product because you're predictable, So, I know that there are publications that have had a policy, for example, of like, when we're only going to show support for things and we're only going to like talk about things that we like. And there's definitely like value to that and there's a spot for that. But for me as a reader, like, why am I going to pick that up? Because I just, what you're going to get in advance. You know that you're going to get like, here's these great things happening. Yay, which is cool. But if someone's also like, and here's this thing kind of sucked, then when they say something's good, you're like, oh yeah, that's actually good. So,
that's
if you're a food influencer on Instagram, like, why are you going to say something sucked? Like really, like because you want restaurants to pay you to go to restaurants, and that's that's the thing. And it's like, well, or fashion. Talking about those fashion magazines. Well, a fashion influencer has quite different incentives than this niche publication that prints twice a year. They have to be immediately on trend, and rather than sort of setting trends, they have to exaggerate everything to get attention in that atmosphere. Like they have to be positive, or at least sort of brand sensitive, and whether or not that's like crassly promotional, So yeah, all of which is to say, I would love more of that. I just don't know where it comes from. I don't know who's willing to do it. Criticism doesn't come from nowhere. If there's not avenues for people to learn how to do it, you're just going to get less of it. That's certainly happening now.
Yeah.
As the blogosphere kind of turned into social media, really, a lot of that sort of learning of how do I construct like a piece of written criticism goes away. I mean, that said, there's interesting things happening on like, I don't know, like YouTube video essays and stuff. And there's a whole like different school of criticism that we're not a part of, and that don't really like work in the same way or in the same context. So it's not that it's all gone, but it's certainly changed. And I think it's a concern, like I mean, just being a part of like, talking a lot to writers and stuff. I mean, I hear all the time like, so-and-so's book sucked and whatever. And then, but no one will write it, you know?
No, it's incredibly hard. That's probably a really great segue to the last thing I wanted to ask you about. So obviously, alongside looking at the social photos in my parents' copies of Metro, the other thing I loved dearly was Felicity Ferret. And we've sort of talked about this a little bit before, but I just wanted to know, not whether or not Felicity will ever come back, obviously, God rest her soul, whether or not, and I mean, I guess this is kind of a similar conversation to the one around the sort of current climate around review and critique. Is there still room for good snark?
I think there kind of has to be, or either there has to be or I just want it to be so.
I think that might be it.
It's certainly like a question that we've asked ourselves a few times is if Felicity Ferret were to come back, what would be, what is the 2025 version of that? And it's interesting because when we came back and sort of reformulated and restarted the magazine post-Bauer, post-COVID, when we talked about it then, we were like, oh, actually, like all of that sort of stuff has gone to Twitter, And then maybe that's the kind of, that's the home of that kind of like social critique now or social satire. And then, Twitter became X and it's all changed and it's a very different platform than it was. So maybe there are opportunities there. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly something that's inherent in the magazine is like a kind of like just not overbearing, but a slice of meanness, Yes. And it's interesting because meanness kind of comes in and out of style.
Yeah.
And but I do think there's that thing of like how would you do it now? Because is it that we don't have enough monocultural reference points for those things to be meaningful? Like it's harder and harder to talk about like, oh my God, so and so did this because unless they're in your sort of social circle, there's a good chance you just don't know about them. So if a 25-year-old Shortland Street star did something really embarrassing at an art gallery opening, would that be fun to write about? Yes. Would most people know who that person is? No.
Yeah.
So does it really matter? Is it then fun to read, or are you just then like, are you basically like then just shooting at civilians?
If people don't know who they are and they're not celebrities, then perhaps. Look, I am hopeful that perhaps there is an era returning where that kind of social satire and commentary could exist. Maybe within the pages of Metro, but at the very least within New Zealand society.
Well, we used to be a very satirical society. Like the shows that I grew up watching. There was always like there was a lot of current affairs satire. All that stuff was really like I think part of the national kind of ethos, and to the extent that we had a national humour, like satire was probably it. And it's largely sort of dead.
Well, look, this is our call
on life support. I don't know
to revive it, or at least make sure it survives. Hey, Henry, thank you very much for coming on The Fold to talk with me about incredibly wide-ranging subject matter.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great.
Great.
Mm-hmm.